June 6, 1944. At 3:14 a.m., the darkness above the English Channel was shattered by the roar of over 1,200 aircraft engines. Below, the largest armada in human history cut through choppy waters toward the coast of Nazi-occupied France. In the lead bomber, Flight Lieutenant James Morrison gripped his radio and spoke the words that would echo through history. "This is it, gentlemen. Today we break the Atlantic Wall. Within hours, nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers would storm 5 heavily fortified beaches along a 50-mile stretch of French coastline. By sunset, Nazi Germany's most formidable defensive line would be cracking under the weight of an assault so massive, so perfectly coordinated, that it would change the course of World War II forever." But the story of D-Day isn't just about numbers. It's about the exact moments when individual acts of courage shattered what Hitler believed was an impregnable fortress. It's about the precise minutes when Nazi defenses, built over 3 years of backbreaking labour, began to crumble under Allied firepower and determination. And it's about how the largest seaborne invasion in history succeeded against odds that seemed mathematically impossible. To understand how Nazi defences were broken on June 6th, we need to understand exactly what the Allies were facing. By 1944, Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched from the tip of Norway to the border of Spain. This wasn't just a line of trenches. This was an engineering marvel of destruction, designed to make any invasion attempt a catastrophic failure. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months transforming the Norman coastline into a killing zone. Millions of cubic yards of steel-reinforced concrete had been poured into fortresses that bristled with artillery capable of turning landing craft into floating coffins. At Omaha Beach alone, 13 massive strongpoints called Widerstandsnester dominated the shoreline. Each strongpoint contained interlocking fields of fire designed to catch invading forces in deadly crossfires, from which there would be no escape. The German strategy was brutally simple. Destroy the invasion at the waterline. Turn the beaches themselves into graveyards. Make the cost so horrific that Allied morale would shatter and force a negotiated peace. Hitler had stationed nearly 1 million men along the Atlantic Wall, backed by the veteran 352nd Infantry Division, whose soldiers had survived the Eastern Front against the Soviets. These weren't green recruits. These were hardened combat veterans who knew how to kill efficiently. But on the morning of June 6th, those defences faced something they had never encountered before, an assault so overwhelming in its scope and coordination that it defied every assumption German planners had made about Allied capabilities. The breaking of Nazi defences began at exactly 3 a.m., with the largest aerial bombardment in military history. Over 1,200 Allied aircraft pounded German artillery positions and defensive installations in a thunderous prelude to invasion. The psychological impact was immediate. German soldiers, who had spent years believing their fortifications were impregnable, suddenly found themselves cowering in bunkers as hundreds of tons of high explosives rained down from the sky. At 3:30 a.m., Major General Richard Gale's 6th Airborne Division landed at Ranville, having already liberated the town 30 minutes earlier in a lightning strike that caught German defenders completely off guard. These weren't random paratroop drops. These were surgical strikes designed to secure the flanks of the invasion beaches and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coastal defences. The precision was staggering. At 4:30 a.m., the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division entered Sainte-Mère-Église, establishing American control over a critical transportation hub. German communication lines were being severed systematically. Reinforcement routes were being blocked. The Atlantic Wall was being isolated from the inland support it desperately needed. At 5:50 a.m., 137 Allied warships opened fire on the Normandy coast in a naval bombardment that shook the earth for miles inland. This wasn't random shelling. Every gun had been assigned specific targets based on months of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. German defensive positions that had taken years to build were being methodically destroyed in minutes. By 6 a.m., British air raids had concluded their strikes on the 10 German battery positions that posed the greatest threat to the invasion beaches. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies just 2 years earlier, was virtually absent. Allied air superiority was so complete that German defenders felt abandoned, left to face the invasion with minimal air support. Then came the moment that would define the entire operation. At 6:30 a.m., Allied troops began landing on 5 assault beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The scale was unprecedented. More than 5,000 ships supported the operation. Nearly 160,000 men would hit the beaches in the first wave. The largest seaborne invasion in history was underway. But it was at Omaha Beach where Nazi defenses faced their greatest test and where the breaking point would be most dramatic. The Americans designated to assault Omaha Beach faced what military historians now call a perfect killing zone. The Germans had positioned their weapons to deliver grazing and filleted fire across the entire beach, meaning there was virtually no safe ground between the waterline and the bluffs beyond. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 a.m. and immediately encountered the most ferocious resistance of the entire D-Day operation. Landing craft became hung up on beach obstacles that German engineers had placed specifically to create chaos during a landing attempt. Mines exploded under advancing soldiers. Steel obstacles that were meant to destroy landing craft instead became the only cover available for American troops pinned down by murderous machine gun fire. The first 5 minutes at Omaha Beach were catastrophic for Allied forces. Nearly 90% of the first assault wave was put out of action before they had advanced 50 yards inland. Officers and non-commissioned officers were cut down by German marksmen who had been waiting for months for this moment. The survivors, many of them wounded, organized themselves into small groups and sought whatever cover they could find among the steel obstacles and shell craters. For 3.5 hours, it appeared that Hitler's strategy was working. The Nazi defenses at Omaha Beach were holding. American forces were pinned down, taking horrific casualties, and making virtually no progress toward their objectives. German machine gunners in the strongpoints above the beach methodically swept the landing zone with interlocking fields of fire that seemed impossible to overcome. But at 9:30 a.m., something changed. Individual American soldiers began making decisions that would crack the Nazi defensive system. Small groups of survivors started moving between the most heavily defended strongpoints, finding weak spots in the German defensive scheme. These weren't grand tactical maneuvers coordinated by generals. These were desperate, improvised assaults by soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The breakthrough moment came when 2 American destroyers made a decision that violated every rule of naval warfare. They approached within 1 kilometer of the shore, close enough that they could provide direct fire support to the pinned-down infantry. This was incredibly dangerous. German shore batteries could have destroyed both ships, but the destroyer commanders understood that without immediate fire support, the entire Omaha Beach assault would fail. The naval gunfire was devastatingly effective. Strongpoints WN-62 and WN-64, which had been raking American forces with machine gun fire for hours, were silenced by direct hits from naval artillery. Suddenly, sections of the beach that had been impassable death traps became corridors through which American forces could advance. By 10 a.m., nearly 4 hours after the initial landings, American forces at Omaha Beach began to demonstrate the fundamental flaw in German defensive planning. The Nazi strategy had assumed that overwhelming firepower at the waterline would break Allied morale and force a retreat. But the Americans weren't retreating. Instead, they were adapting, regrouping, and finding ways to turn German defensive advantages against the defenders themselves. The moment that truly broke Nazi resistance at Omaha came when approximately 200 soldiers from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions of the 16th Infantry Regiment managed to regroup under the most hellish conditions imaginable. These men, many of them wounded, most of them separated from their original units, formed an improvised assault force that military historians would later call miraculous. They had no grand plan. They had no detailed intelligence about German positions. What they had was determination and the understanding that staying pinned down on the beach meant certain death. The breakthrough began in Sector Fox Green, where German fire was slightly less concentrated than in other areas. American soldiers started moving in small groups, using shell craters and destroyed landing craft as cover. They weren't following textbook assault tactics. They were improvising solutions to problems that no military academy had ever taught them how to solve. Some groups crawled forward under machine gun fire. Others sprinted between obstacles, accepting casualties to gain ground. The key was that they kept moving forward when every instinct told them to seek cover and wait for reinforcements. At exactly 10:15 a.m., Brigadier General Norman Cotter made a decision that would echo through military history. Standing amid the chaos of Dog-White Sector, with German machine gun bullets snapping overhead, he turned to a group of Rangers and shouted words that became legendary. "Rangers! Lead the way!" This wasn't just a rallying cry. It was a tactical decision to use the Rangers' specialized training to find paths through the German defensive maze. The Rangers responded by doing what they had been trained to do. They identified the dead spaces in German fields of fire, the small areas where interlocking machine gun positions couldn't cover simultaneously. Using these gaps, they began working their way up the bluffs between the most heavily fortified strongpoints. It was dangerous, improvised warfare, but it worked because the German defensive plan hadn't anticipated small unit infiltration tactics. Meanwhile, at the eastern end of Omaha Beach, the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, was mounting its own assault on the German positions at Easy Red and Fox Green sectors. These veterans of the North African and Italian campaigns understood that frontal assaults against prepared positions were suicide. Instead, they used suppressive fire to pin down German defenders, while assault teams worked their way around the flanks of individual strongpoints. The critical moment came when American forces realized that the German strongpoints, while formidable when facing seaward, were vulnerable from the sides and rear. The Nazi engineers had designed these positions to repel a direct assault from the beach, but they hadn't adequately protected against infiltration attacks. American soldiers began using the Germans' own defensive advantages against them, approaching strongpoints from angles the defenders hadn't anticipated. By 11:30 a.m., the psychological tide had turned completely. German defenders who had spent the morning confidently mowing down American assault waves suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions. American forces were no longer pinned down on the beach. They were moving inland, reducing strongpoints one by one, and forcing German defenders to abandon positions they had held confidently just hours earlier. The breaking of Nazi defenses at Omaha Beach wasn't the result of a single dramatic moment. It was the cumulative effect of hundreds of individual decisions by American soldiers who refused to accept defeat. Every German strongpoint that fell made the next one more vulnerable. Every section of beach that was cleared provided a base for further advances. The Nazi defensive system, which had seemed impregnable at 6:30 a.m., was collapsing under the weight of sustained pressure and tactical adaptation. But Omaha Beach was just one of 5 landing zones where Nazi defenses were being tested to their breaking point. At Utah Beach, American forces were encountering much lighter resistance than expected, but this created its own challenges. The 4th Infantry Division landed in the wrong location due to strong currents, but rather than attempting to move to their designated landing zone, they adapted their assault plan to the actual conditions they faced. The decision to proceed from the wrong landing zone proved tactically brilliant. The area where American forces actually landed was more lightly defended than their original target. By 8 a.m., Utah Beach was secured with minimal casualties, and American forces were advancing inland toward their first-day objectives. The flexibility to adapt plans based on actual conditions rather than predetermined assumptions, was proving decisive against German defensive preparations. At Gold Beach, British forces were encountering the kind of systematic resistance that German planners had envisioned across all the landing zones. The 50th Infantry Division faced well-prepared strongpoints, extensive minefields, and determined German defenders. But the British had learned crucial lessons from earlier amphibious assaults, particularly the disastrous raid on Dieppe in 1942. The key difference was the use of specialized armor designed specifically for beach assault operations. Churchill tanks equipped with flails cleared paths through German minefields. Engineering vehicles filled anti-tank ditches and destroyed obstacles that would have stopped conventional armor. Most importantly, the British coordinated their assault with devastating naval gunfire that systematically destroyed German defensive positions before infantry attempted to advance. By 9:45 a.m., British forces at Gold Beach had broken through the coastal defences and were advancing toward the town of Bayeux. The German 352nd Infantry Division, which had performed so effectively at Omaha Beach, was being stretched thin as they attempted to defend multiple landing zones simultaneously. The Nazi strategy of concentrated defense was failing because the Allies had attacked on such a broad front that German reserves couldn't be everywhere at once. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces were demonstrating that the breaking of Nazi defences required not just courage, but also technical innovation and tactical flexibility. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had studied German defensive techniques extensively and developed specific countermeasures for each type of obstacle they expected to encounter. The Canadians used a combination of direct assault and infiltration tactics that kept German defenders off balance. While some units engaged strongpoints directly, others moved around them, creating multiple threats that German commanders couldn't address simultaneously. By 10:30 a.m., Canadian forces had penetrated further inland than any other Allied units, proving that the Nazi defensive line could be not just broken, but completely penetrated when attacked with sufficient determination and tactical skill. At Sword Beach, British forces faced perhaps the most complex defensive challenge of the entire operation. German positions were supported by artillery from inland positions that could range the entire beach area. The 3rd British Infantry Division had to coordinate their assault with airborne forces that had landed behind German lines hours earlier, while simultaneously dealing with immediate coastal defences. The breakthrough at Sword Beach came when British forces realised that German artillery positions were being directed by forward observers in the coastal strongpoints. By neutralising the observation posts first, they could significantly reduce the effectiveness of German indirect fire support. This tactical insight, developed during the actual assault rather than in pre-invasion planning, allowed British forces to advance more rapidly than German defenders had believed possible. The most dramatic moment in the breaking of Nazi defences came at Pointe du Hoc, where American Rangers faced what appeared to be an impossible mission. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion had been assigned to scale 100-foot cliffs under direct enemy fire and neutralise German artillery positions that could devastate both Utah and Omaha beaches. The Rangers knew they were facing a suicide mission, but they also understood that failure would cost thousands of American lives on the beaches below. At 7:10 a.m., 40 minutes behind schedule due to navigation errors, the Rangers finally approached the base of the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. German defenders above them had every advantage. They held the high ground. They had prepared positions. They could drop grenades and fire directly down at the approaching Americans. The Rangers had rope ladders, grappling hooks, and determination. The mathematics seemed hopeless, but the Rangers had trained for exactly this scenario. They understood that their mission wasn't just tactically important, it was psychologically crucial. If American forces could take an objective that seemed impossible, it would demonstrate to German defenders that nowhere was safe from Allied assault. The psychological impact would ripple through the entire Nazi defensive system. The climb began under withering fire from German positions. Rangers fell from the cliffs, cut down by machine gun bullets, or killed when grenades exploded among the climbing teams. But others kept climbing, using techniques they had practiced on similar cliffs in England. By 7:20 a.m., the first group of 20 rangers from Dog Company reached the summit. They immediately dispersed into small assault teams and began working their way toward the German gun positions. Within 15 minutes, Pointe du Hoc was secured. The Rangers had accomplished what German planners believed was impossible. More importantly, they had demonstrated that Nazi defences, no matter how well positioned or heavily fortified, could be overcome by soldiers willing to accept extreme risks to accomplish their mission. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating. As word spread along the German communication networks that Pointe du Hoc had fallen, Nazi commanders began to understand that their defensive calculations were fundamentally flawed. They had assumed that certain positions were impregnable based on terrain advantages and firepower concentration. The Rangers had proven that American forces would attempt objectives that rational military planning suggested were impossible and would succeed through sheer determination and tactical innovation. By noon on June 6th, the pattern was clear across all 5 landing beaches. Nazi defences were not just being broken, they were being systematically dismantled by Allied forces that refused to accept that any position was too strong to assault. German strongpoints that had held confidently through the morning were being reduced one after another. Communication lines that connected defensive positions were being severed. Supply routes that brought ammunition and reinforcements to coastal positions were being cut by airborne forces operating behind German lines. By sunset on June 6, 1944, the Atlantic Wall lay in ruins. Hitler's impregnable fortress had been shattered not by overwhelming numbers alone, but by the courage of individual soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The exact moment Nazi defences broke wasn't a single dramatic instant, but hundreds of small acts of heroism that proved no defensive line, however formidable, could withstand the determination of free people fighting for liberation. D-Day had begun the countdown to Nazi Germany's inevitable collapse.